Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go! Women freed from Dachau laugh and cry at the same time as they realize years of confinement are finally over. The photo was taken on April 29, 1945 in southern Germany, the day United States troops reached the camp. During World War I, message dogs carried tiny notes in collar tubes when field wires made human runners too slow. Some dogs crossed rough ground faster than people, turning one small animal into a moving line of communication. Ethel Granger became famous in Britain for a waist reported at only 33 centimeters after years of tight corset training. Her look turned a private fashion choice into one of the most extreme body records ever photographed. The French liner SS Normandy rolled onto its side in New York Harbor in 1942 while being converted into a troop ship. Once one of the fastest and most luxurious ships in the world, it never returned to sea after this disaster. An injured Harlem Hellfighters soldier returned to New York as crowds welcomed one of the most famous Black American units of World War I. The unit spent 191 days in frontline service in France, longer than any other American regiment in that war. A Soviet collective farmer holds the grain he received for 2 years of work, with the sacks marked 5 kilograms 300 grams for 1932 and 8 kilograms for 1933. In the 1930s, many collective farms paid workers in labor days, so a full year of work could end as only a few kilograms of grain. Logging crews in the 1900s lifted huge tree trunks with basic cable rigs while workers stood almost directly below them. One slipping log or snap chain could turn a normal shift into a life-changing accident. Stalin addressed the crowd at Mikhail Frunze's funeral in 1925, standing before the Kremlin wall on a plain wooden platform. Frunze was only 40, and his name later marked one of the most important Soviet military academies. A French soldier fills his canteen from large barrels in a Western Front trench in 1916, with mud packed around the water point. In World War I, even clean water had to be moved forward by carts, pipes, and barrels before it reached soldiers. Pablo Escobar appears in this early 1970s mugshot before his name became known around the world. The simple number board 113533 turned this plain police photo into one of his most recognizable early images. Rudolph the Flea pulls a tiny metal merry-go-round across a human fingertip in 1951. Flea circuses used real insects tied with ultra-thin wire, turning one of the smallest performers into a strange public attraction. Efunroye Tinubu was a powerful Lagos businesswoman who built huge influence in the 1800s through trade, politics, and the sale of enslaved people. By her death in 1887, she had become one of the richest women in West Africa and a major figure in Yoruba history. A U-2 spy plane photographed Soviet missile sites in Cuba in 1962, only about 145 kilometers from Florida. The discovery triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis, a 13-day standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. Alfred Glassell Jr. caught this 707-kilogram black marlin off Peru in 1953, creating one of sport fishing's most famous records. More than 70 years later, the massive catch is still listed as the heaviest black marlin ever recorded by rod and reel. In Bulgaria, in 1940, a folk healer treated back pain with smoke, chants, and an axe placed near the body. The ritual shows how rural medicine mixed herbs, fear, and old beliefs before modern care reached many villages. Canadian Corps soldiers ride a small railway through a heavily damaged French village in June 1918, with the tracks cutting straight between ruined homes. By 1918, these temporary rail lines moved people, food, and supplies across places where normal roads no longer worked. A Turkish bride from 1919 looks much older because her face was covered with gilt leaf for a modesty tradition. The caption says she was only 16, and her hands reveal the age that the strange face covering hides. Two red prisoners stand in the snow before white guards during the Finnish Civil War in 1918. The short war began just after Finland gained independence and split the new country before its government was fully settled. A snow-clearing tractor pushes through a city street in 1925 using chained wheels for grip on packed snow. Before modern plow fleets, machines like this helped keep streetcars, cars, and foot traffic moving through winter cities. A giant leatherback sea turtle was caught near Genoa, Italy, drawing a crowd because of its massive size. Leatherbacks are the largest living turtles, and the biggest recorded ones can weigh more than 900 kilograms. A Curtiss P-40 Kitty Hawk is being unpacked from shipping crates in Casablanca in February 1944 after arriving from the United States for French forces. The aircraft crossed the ocean in pieces, then had to be rebuilt on site before it could return to service. Julianne Kopju was 17 when she fell about 3 kilometers into the Peruvian jungle in 1971 and became the only survivor from 92 people on board. She walked for 11 days through the rainforest before finding help, using survival skills taught by her father. Philips workers pose in the 1890s, when the Dutch company was still a small light bulb maker in Eindhoven. The business began in 1891 and later grew into one of the world's best-known electronics names. Unsinkable Sam was the ship cat said to have served on a German battleship, a British destroyer, and then an aircraft carrier. The famous story says he survived the loss of all 3 ships and became one of the strangest animal legends of the Second World War. Joe Arity, a Colorado man with an intelligence score of 46, was wrongly convicted in the 1930s for a case he barely understood. Colorado pardoned him in 2011, more than 70 years later, after his name became a symbol of a failed justice system. Samuel F.B. Morse helped turn long-distance messages into electric signals, making communication faster than any horse, ship, or train. By the 1860s, Morse code and telegraph lines were already linking cities across the United States and beyond. 3 sailors from the MV Zandam were rescued by USSPC 576 on January 23, 1943, after spending 83 days on a life raft. Their survival became one of the most astonishing sea rescue stories of the Second World War. German aircraft hit Allied landing ships off Anzio, Italy, during Operation Shingle on January 22, 1944. The sea columns around the ships show how exposed the invasion force was while trying to build a beachhead near Rome. Mexican Emperor Maximilian stood before Benito Juárez's forces in 1867, only 3 years after France had placed him on the throne. His fall ended the French-backed empire in Mexico and restored the republic under Juárez. The Clifton Suspension Bridge was still being built in Bristol in 1864, with workers standing beneath its unfinished stone towers. Designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, it opened the same year and still spans the Avon Gorge today. Moscow was left in smoking ruins in 1917 as revolution turned parts of the city into rubble and twisted metal. That same year, the Russian Empire ended and the first Soviet government took power. Women liberated from Bergen-Belsen carry bread rations in 1945, with some still wearing striped camp clothing. The camp was freed by British forces, and food became one of the first signs that survival was finally possible. British soldiers and survivors watched the remaining Bergen-Belsen barracks burn in 1945 after liberation. The buildings were destroyed to stop disease from spreading, turning the camp's final structures into black smoke. New York fortune tellers stand in a police photo in 1943 with the date board showing July 21st. At that time, fortune telling could bring women from street rooms and parlors straight into a police lineup. Japanese officers salute a British soldier's grave in British Malaya in early 1942 during Japan's rapid advance toward Singapore. The small wooden cross marks an enemy burial in jungle terrain just weeks before Singapore fell in February 1942. A United States military photographer sets up a large tripod camera in a flooded World War I trench with water covering the floor around him. These heavy cameras had to be carried into muddy frontline spaces so people at home could see the war through real photographs. Ethiopian men carrying captured Italian rifles wait in May 1941 to hear the proclamation of Emperor Haile Selassie's return. His return marked the collapse of Italian rule in Ethiopia after 5 years of exile. Anti-submarine nets stretched across harbors to block German U-boats from reaching ships and naval bases. The floating drums kept the heavy steel barriers near the surface, turning open water into a hidden defense line. A mobile field brothel for officers was built on wagon wheels, with a sign openly advertising its purpose. The photo shows how military life once carried even private vice in portable wooden rooms. A woman appears in a 1940 Los Angeles police photo with the word lesbian written under her record. The image shows how same-sex identity could be treated as a police matter in the United States at that time. Freikorps soldiers stand beside an armored car in Berlin during the Spartacist uprising in 1919. The unrest came just months after Germany lost World War I, when the new republic was still fighting for control of its own capital. An East German border guard aims at a fleeing citizen in 1989, only months before the Berlin Wall fell. That same year, the border system collapsed after 28 years of dividing Berlin. North Vietnamese T-54B Tank No. 843 reached the South Vietnamese Presidential Palace on April 30, 1975, becoming one of the first tanks at the main entrance. That moment marked the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War. Arab women and children walked through the West Bank neutral zone on June 26, 1948, after leaving their village during the Nakba. In 1948, more than 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, turning ordinary family roads into routes away from home. A Soviet T-26 tank pulls an armored sled with soldiers across the snow during the Winter War against Finland. The sled was meant to carry troops close to Finnish lines, while the tank pushed through deep winter terrain. Israeli forces used this black Mercedes during Operation Entebbe in 1976 to approach the Uganda airport as part of a rescue mission. The car was chosen to resemble Idi Amin's official convoy, helping the team get close before the operation began. San Francisco's streetcar tracks twisted out of the road after the 1906 earthquake tore through the city's streets. The disaster damaged much of the city, and broken rail lines like these showed how the ground itself had shifted. Farmers in McIntosh County, North Dakota, wait to cast their ballots in 1940, sitting in caps and work clothes inside a local polling place. The photo shows rural American voters during the same election year that gave Franklin Roosevelt his third presidential term. Soviet submarine K-181 surfaced at the North Pole on September 29, 1963, after finding a rare opening in the ice. The ice there was still 30 to 50 centimeters thick, turning a tiny gap into the only path to the surface. A young Putin sits with his parents in 1985 before leaving for Germany during the late Cold War. That move placed him in East Germany just 4 years before the Berlin Wall fell. World War I left the Western Front looking like a broken moonscape, with trench lines crossing the ground in every direction. Thousands of craters from shells and underground blasts covered the land, showing how deeply the battlefield changed the Earth. In 1930, this early deep-sea diving suit was lifted back from 180 feet with the diver unharmed. The rigid metal suit let a person go far underwater while staying sealed from the crushing pressure outside. A Harvard Medical School professor teaches in 1929 beside an enormous human skull model built for anatomy lectures. The giant scale made tiny bone details visible to a whole classroom before digital screens existed. Australia's 1932 Emu War began when huge emu flocks damaged wheat farms in Western Australia, leading soldiers to bring a Lewis gun into the fields. The second campaign removed about 3,000 birds, turning a farm problem into one of history's strangest military operations. A fan-powered car from the 1910s used a giant rear propeller instead of normal wheel drive, turning the road vehicle into a strange half-car, half-aircraft machine. It never became popular, but its huge spinning fan made it one of the oddest transport experiments of the early automobile age. Soviet planners expected a fast victory in 1939, but Finland's snow, forests, and mobile ski troops slowed the advance for months. The Winter War lasted 105 days and made a small country's resistance famous around the world. A bear climbed a tall power pole in Wilcox, Arizona, and ended up sitting above the wires like it had chosen the worst possible resting place. Utility workers shut off the power and helped the animal climb down safely. This formal portrait marks the induction of Morristown, New Jersey's first black policeman. At a time when black officers were still rare in many American towns, the photo captured a local barrier being broken. Indigenous children sit in a Canadian residential school, part of a system built to separate them from family, language, and culture. Over more than 160 years, about 150,000 children passed through these schools, and the last federally funded one closed in 1997. A newspaper once promoted a pretty gas mask, trying to make protective gear look stylish instead of frightening. The design covered the face but left the hair visible, turning wartime fear into a strange fashion pitch. The virtues stand above the vices on Strasbourg Cathedral in this 1853 photo, turning moral lessons into stone figures. Medieval visitors could read the message without words. Good rises above human weakness. A pioneering woman pilot crossed the English Channel on April 16, 1912, just one day after the Titanic disaster filled world news. Her flight from Dover to Calais made aviation history, but the timing kept her record from getting the attention it deserved. Alexander Graham Bell tested giant tetrahedral kites in the early 1900s, hoping their linked triangle cells could lift people into the air. The strange shape looked futuristic, but it was part of real aviation experiments before airplanes became practical. The sailing ship Mildred was photographed in 1912 while sinking upright, with its sails still raised above the water. Fog pushed it off course near the Isles of Scilly, creating one of the strangest shipwreck photos ever taken. A late 1800s cradleboard held a baby tightly in a wooden frame, with padding, lacing, and a raised guard to protect the head. Many North American tribes used designs like this so a child could be carried, placed upright, or safely hung nearby. An English political figure, his son, and a famous French fashion designer pose with hounds near Dieppe around 1928. The quiet country scene is striking because it brought high politics and high fashion into the same rural outing. A famous American landscape photographer laughs at a radio microphone in 1979, decades after becoming known for sharp black and white views of the American West. A childhood injury during the 1906 San Francisco earthquake permanently changed the shape of his nose. A German camp guard sits in captivity after the war, photographed in a plain room far from the authority she once had. Her case became one of the most infamous trials linked to the Nazi camp system. A Pennsylvania man became a local legend after a childhood electrical accident left him with severe facial injuries and made him walk rural roads mostly at night. Locals later called him the Green Man, and his nightly walks turned him into one of Western Pennsylvania's strangest folk stories. A British royal couple reviews a line of scouts at Windsor Castle in 1939, just months before Europe entered a new war. The visit was tied to St. George's Day, one of the most important dates in the Scout movement. A roller skating car hop served customers at a 1950s drive-in, carrying orders straight to cars without making drivers step out. Skates helped workers move fast as drive-in restaurants became a symbol of American car culture. Alexander Graham Bell's early telephone model from 1875 turned human speech into an electrical signal for the first time. This simple wooden and metal device opened the path to voice calls across cities, countries, and oceans. During the Civil War, an enslaved woman at Arlington House was trusted with the mansion's keys when the family fled Virginia. She is credited with protecting George Washington heirlooms that could have disappeared from the house forever. German tank crew graves stand in front of their damaged Panzer III, dated August 2, 1941. The photo turns one armored vehicle into a full story of the Eastern Front's brutal cost. A horn book was not a real book, but a single learning sheet fixed to a board and protected by thin, transparent horn. For centuries, children used it to learn letters, numbers, and prayers before paper school books became common. The Vanguard TV-3 launch in 1957 was meant to put America's first satellite into orbit, but the rocket failed almost instantly. Only 2 seconds after liftoff, it lost thrust and dropped back onto the pad, while the small satellite was thrown nearby. Austro-Hungarian gendarmes stand on winter guard duty in 1914, wrapped in heavy, shaggy coats against the snow. Their bulky, cold-weather gear shows how a frozen post could be as punishing as the patrol itself. Carolina Olsson of Öknö, Sweden, went to bed at age 14 in 1876 and was said to remain asleep for 32 years. Doctors could not explain her case, and she became one of Sweden's strangest medical mysteries. Hendon Airport in London shows early aircraft flying in 1912 when aviation still looked like a public experiment more than normal travel. Only 9 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, crowds were already watching planes rise from organized airfields. Robert Peary's expedition claimed to reach the North Pole on April 6, 1909, after years of failed Arctic attempts. The claim became world famous, but historians still debate whether the team truly reached the exact pole. At the 1913 Epsom Derby, a women's voting rights protester stepped onto the track and was hit by King George V's horse, Anmer. She died 4 days later, and the moment became one of the most famous images of the British suffrage movement. In 1966, a Chinese leader was photographed swimming in the Yangtze River near Wuhan to project strength and control. The image became political theater, showing a staged public display during one of China's most intense historical moments. A photographer hangs in a wooden crate above London in 1929, using a crane to capture streets from the air. Before drones, aerial city shots could mean sitting over traffic with only ropes, wood, and a camera. Finnish CBRN troops train in 1958, testing protective suits, masks, and detection gear during the Cold War. The glossy coats and sealed helmets look almost futuristic, but they were built for one of the most feared threats of the era. On the set of Metropolis, the director stands above a huge crowd while shaping one of cinema's first great science fiction worlds. Released in 1927, the film used massive sets and hundreds of extras to create a future city that still influences movies today. Dr. Evan O'Neill Kane performed his own hernia operation in the United States in 1932 while nurses stood around the table. At age 70, he used local anesthesia to prove major surgery could be done without putting a patient fully to sleep. In 1960, Moscow doctors traced a smallpox case brought from India by artist Alexei Kokorakin and launched an emergency containment effort. The city rapidly tracked contacts and vaccinated millions, stopping a wider outbreak before it could take over Moscow. Russia bought this Chernomor-type airship from Britain to search the Black Sea for submarines, shown here from the rear inside its hangar. The tiny people below reveal its huge scale, built for naval patrols long before radar became common. In Panama, workers sprayed oil on standing water to stop mosquito larvae from reaching the surface for air. This simple method helped protect canal and jungle work sites before modern mosquito control existed. A German artillery crew marked its weapon with symbols showing claimed aircraft, tanks, and other targets during World War II. The painted tally turned the side of the gun into a battlefield scorecard. Lewis Hine photographed breaker boys in a Pennsylvania coal mine in January 1911, where young workers picked rock from coal by hand. Images like this helped push child labor reform in the United States by showing children inside the industrial workday. The 20th of July, 1944 plot at Wolf's Lair nearly changed World War II when a bomb went off inside a meeting room at 12:43. The target survived with injuries, and the failed plot led to a massive purge of the conspirators. The United States Capitol was still under construction in the mid-1800s, with its great dome rising above unfinished grounds. The building became the seat of Congress while Washington was still growing from a raw capital into a national symbol. Madison Square Garden rises as a steel skeleton above Manhattan in 1966, surrounded by dense New York blocks. The arena opened in 1968 on the site of the old Pennsylvania Station, becoming one of the world's most famous indoor venues. The Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896 lasted only 38 minutes, making it the shortest recorded war in history. The ruined palace in Zanzibar became the visible proof of a conflict that ended almost as soon as it began. A truck carrying gin overturned in Arnhem, Netherlands in 1952, spilling crates across a wide city road. The scattered boxes turned a normal traffic accident into a strange public scene that stopped pedestrians in their tracks. World War I prisoners stand behind barbed wire in 1917, with one man wearing a bandage over his eyes. The close faces show how captivity could reduce huge armies to silent lines of tired men. A 200-inch glass disc for the Hale telescope is being moved through a city street before it became part of the Palomar Observatory project. That single mirror helped create the world's largest effective telescope from 1948 to 1976. The Knickerbocker Baseball Club posed in Hoboken in 1858, creating what is often called the first team photo in baseball history. The image captures baseball before uniforms, stadiums, and million-dollar leagues turned it into a national sport. During Operation Archery in 1941, British commandos carry an injured man toward a landing craft on the Norwegian coast. The mission showed that small sea landing teams could reach occupied Europe from the water and disappear before a larger response arrived. 3 World War II soldiers pose as close friends, but the caption says only the man in the middle returned home. The damaged photo now carries a harsher fact than the uniforms: 2 empty places behind one survivor. In Petawawa in 1922, a trained World War I horse leaps through a flaming obstacle with its rider low over the saddle. Horses like this were prepared for noise, smoke, and chaos because armies still depended on them for transport and movement. At the 1939 Golden Gate Exposition in San Francisco, premature babies in incubators were shown to crowds as a paid public attraction. Before neonatal units became standard, exhibits like this helped prove that incubators could keep tiny newborns alive. A British archaeologist takes notes inside a stone room at Chichen Itza in 1900 using a simple field desk and chair. His records helped preserve details of Maya ruins before many sites were fully cleared or restored. A man wears a Georgian choka, a traditional coat with rows of small chest tubes called gazirs. Those tubes were made to carry measured powder for early rifles, turning clothing into a ready field kit. Iran released 52 American hostages in 1981 after 444 days of captivity, ending one of the most tense crises between the two countries. The final release came just minutes after Ronald Reagan became President of the United States. In 1940, a 23-year-old RAF squadron leader stands in flight gear, his face showing the pressure carried by pilots barely out of their teens. The caption says the average RAF pilot was only 20, and this officer was lost in combat 2 years later. A 1940s parachutist radio operator had to jump with a radio kit, maps, tools, food, medical items, and fighting gear spread out in one heavy load. The layout shows how one airborne soldier carried both communication equipment and survival supplies before landing behind enemy lines. A German railway gun is prepared in September 1939 before the attack on Poland, mounted on tracks because the weapon was too massive for normal roads. These giant guns could only move by rail, turning train lines into part of the battlefield. Al Capone's fingerprint card lists his alias, prisoner number 5527, and every finger in ink before digital records existed. The word dead stamped across the top turns a routine police file into a final record of America's most famous crime boss. In Belgian Congo in 1935, a woman shows raised body markings made as beauty and identity signs in parts of Central Africa. The shoulder shapes use an ancient luck symbol that existed for thousands of years before it was later misused in Europe. A deep-sea diver steps off a platform in 1915, wearing a heavy metal helmet and an air hose connected to the surface. Before modern scuba gear, divers entered the water with weighted suits that could turn one mistake into a trapped descent. In Maryland in 1950, 4 women posed with a pistol, rifle, and clubs after helping stop 4 men who had frightened their neighborhood for 3 weeks. They held the men until police arrived, turning a front porch photo into a rare record of civilians taking control before officers got there. A Russian stage performer poses in costume in Moscow in 1908, using a studio portrait to preserve the role like a poster. Before cinema ruled entertainment, photos like this carried theater stars and their characters far beyond the stage. Hundreds of aircraft filled the sky over Manhattan in 1931, turning New York's skyline into a massive aerial parade. At the time, the Empire State Building had just opened, and the city was becoming a symbol of both skyscrapers and modern flight. An anarchist armored car marked FAI and CNT was used during the Spanish Civil War in 1938. Its rounded homemade armor shows how militias turned ordinary vehicles into street-fighting machines. In Korea in 1909, workers built a hut wall by hand, fitting stones into a wooden frame under a thatched roof. The photo shows a home made from stone, wood, and straw, with every piece shaped and placed without modern machinery. This early breathing apparatus was made to protect people from toxic battlefield air when masks were still bulky and experimental. The huge eyepieces and chest filters show how strange survival equipment looked before modern respirators existed. The Vespa Tapis was a military scooter built for French paratroopers and fitted with a 75mm recoilless gun. Introduced in 1956, it could be dropped by parachute so crews could move the weapon fast after landing. The masked marvel appeared at Manhattan Opera House in 1915, making him one of the earliest known masked wrestlers in the United States. His hidden face turned a simple wrestling costume into a mystery act that later became a major part of wrestling culture. A German interrogation chamber in Belgium during World War II shows crude tools and rough wooden coffins inside a bare brick room. The empty space was documented as evidence of how occupation forces used fear far from the front line. Recovery personnel inspect the Mercury Atlas 8 capsule on a ship after its 1962 spaceflight. The mission carried astronaut Wally Schirra through 6 Earth orbits before the capsule splashed down in the Pacific. Uniformed plague researchers in the Philippines wear protective masks and special gear in 1912. The equipment was used while studying and preventing plague cases during an outbreak. Under an electron microscope, a snowflake can reveal thick crystal arms covered with tiny frozen branches that no human eye could see. The scale bar is 300 micrometers, about 0.3 millimeters, smaller than many grains of sand. Victorian engineers were already building working submarines before Jules Verne made the Nautilus famous in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The long metal hull and tiny workers show how large these early underwater machines became in the 1800s. In 1918, fans at a Georgia Tech football game sat in the stands wearing face masks during the Spanish flu pandemic. The image shows public events continued even while cities used mask rules to slow the spread. Around 1900, the Moulin Rouge in Paris had a giant elephant-shaped structure beside its outdoor stage, not just a fantasy from the 2001 film. The elephant was large enough to hold private rooms, making it one of the strangest real features of Belle Epoque Paris. San Francisco's Palace of Fine Arts looks like a 1915 landmark, but the structure standing today was rebuilt in the 1960s with steel and concrete. The first version was made for a World Fair from wood and plaster, so it was never meant to last. Steven Spielberg sits on Bruce, the full-size animatronic shark built for Jaws after the prop became one of the hardest parts of the film to control. The model's nickname later inspired the shark named Bruce in Finding Nemo. In 1872, Dina Sanichar was found as a child in India after reportedly living among wolves, then taken to an orphanage near Agra. He learned to walk upright and wear clothes, but never learned to speak, and his story is often linked to Mowgli from the Jungle Book. In Yukon, Canada, women pose outside rough wooden storefronts during a northern frontier boom. The Klondike Gold Rush from 1896 to 1899 turned remote wooden towns into crowded places almost overnight. In the mid-1910s, motorcyclist Johnny Hogg and his wife rode a Harley-Davidson sidecar rig along the curved top of an aqueduct pipeline. The narrow metal pipe left almost no room for error, turning a simple ride into a daring early motorcycle stunt. In Brooklyn in 1920, children used cans and buckets to scoop spilled liquor from street gutters during Prohibition. Agents had broken open barrels nearby, turning a law enforcement action into a strange public scene on the cobblestones. In 1970, a Soviet doctor in Sochi used a large medical device to treat headaches for 2 American tourists. The scene captured a rare Cold War-era moment where ordinary health care crossed the political divide. On October 21, 1967, about 100,000 people marched to the Pentagon in one of the largest early protests against the Vietnam conflict. About a dozen entered the building, with 682 arrests and 47 people hurt reported. In 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers on Scotland's remote Island Moor were found missing after a supply ship reached the island. The log mentioned days of wild weather, but a nearby island reported calm conditions. Thomas Dilworth was a Brooklyn-born performer with dwarfism who became famous in the 1800s for singing, dancing, comedy, violin, and stage roles in both men's and women's clothing. He worked across rare touring troupes at a time when black performers had very few paths into American show business. In 1892, Staten Island tennis players posed with wooden rackets while wearing long dresses, striped uniforms, boat hats, and formal collars. Early tennis was still tied to upper-class social life, where players often dressed more for display than speed. On May 1, 1982, Royal Air Force aircraft struck the Argentine-held runway at Port Stanley during the Falklands War. The runway markings and rising smoke show one of the first major airfield targets of the campaign. Lavrenti Beria was born in this modest house in Merkuli, Abkhazia, on March 17, 1899. By 1973, the quiet rural home was still standing, tied to one of the most powerful and secretive figures of the Soviet era. In 1943, Life magazine put a young WASP pilot on its cover, showing women who trained to fly advanced United States aircraft during World War II. She trained on Bell P-39 Airacobras and Martin B-26 Marauders, 2 machines known for demanding serious skill from pilots. The 17-year-old in the caption was photographed after his 1938 arrest in Paris in the Ernst vom Rath case. German leaders used the case as a pretext for Kristallnacht, when Jewish homes, shops, and synagogues were targeted across Germany. American pilots inspect a damaged Japanese Zero at an airfield on Saipan in the Mariana Islands on June 23, 1944. Captured aircraft like this let crews study the Zero's light frame, cockpit layout, and weak points up close. In 1942, the United States President studied a giant globe gifted by the Office of Strategic Services, the intelligence group that came before the Central Intelligence Agency. The globe was used for global planning at a time when maps could shape decisions across oceans. In May 1936, Carl Meidens photographed a little girl inside a sharecropper's shack in the Missouri Ozarks during the Great Depression. Newspapers covered the walls like wallpaper, showing how families reused anything they had in rural America. A rare late 1930s photo shows the German dictator from the caption wearing a leather jacket instead of formal clothing. The unusual outfit stands out because most surviving photos show him in uniforms, suits, or staged public settings. In 1934, the Soviet leader in the caption was photographed kissing his young daughter in a rare private family moment. She later left the Soviet Union in 1967, turning one childhood figure from official photos into an international headline. In 1897, a woman churned butter by hand while reading, turning a slow household chore into quiet study time. The tall wooden churn shows how everyday food work still depended on hand power before electric kitchen tools became common. In 1960, African American citizens lined up in Haywood County, Tennessee, to register to vote while men watched nearby. The photo shows how a basic right could become a tense public act in the American South. In 1897, Marshall Fields in Chicago used about 700 horses and 400 wagons to deliver goods before motor trucks took over city streets. This line of wagons at Holden Court shows how one department store ran a massive delivery system on horsepower. In the 1960s, Yellowstone tourists sometimes fed bears straight from car windows, and the animals learned to line up beside vehicles for food. Park rules later changed because hand-fed bears began treating roads and cars like feeding spots. In 1937, a woman secretly photographed the United States Supreme Court in session through a hole in her handbag. Cameras were barred inside the courtroom, making this one of the rare early images of the court at work. In 1931, the Indian independence leader in the caption was surrounded by crowds in England during his visit for the Round Table Conference. His plaincloth clothing stood out beside the packed street, making the scene instantly recognizable. On April 30, 1945, the German dictator in the caption was inside an underground shelter in Berlin as his regime collapsed above him. The ruined buildings and bunker remains show the capital at the exact moment the promised 1,000-year Reich had lasted only 12 years. Casey Jones was an American train engineer who became famous after a crash in Mississippi on April 30, 1900. He stayed in the train cab to slow the Cannonball Express, helping save passengers before the crash. In 1987, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher visited a Soviet store during her trip to the USSR. The shelves show rows of canned goods, giving viewers a rare look at everyday shopping in the late Soviet era. On April 29, 1945, the German dictator in the caption married his longtime partner inside an underground bunker in Berlin. Soviet forces were already entering the city, and the marriage lasted less than 2 days. On August 4, 1990, Iraq had just taken control of Kuwait, a small oil-rich country on the Persian Gulf. The move led to the Gulf War in 1991, when a United States-led coalition pushed Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. Around 1915, Austro-Hungarian soldiers in Vienna said goodbye to their wives before leaving for World War I service. The station crowd shows how the conflict pulled millions of men away from homes across Europe. These Roman medical tools were found in Pompeii, the ancient city covered by Mount Vesuvius in 79. The set includes forceps, probes, and blade handles, showing that doctors used surprisingly advanced tools nearly 2,000 years ago. In 1980's Makhachkala, this Dagestani Korean wedding captured 2 Soviet communities joining in one family photo. Soviet Koreans were descendants of Korean migrants, many of whom were forced from Russia's Far East to Central Asia in 1937. Around 1920, a Jerusalem street carried German, Arabic, and English signs on the same corner, including the German Palestine Bank. People in robes, suits, and uniforms passed through the city during the early British rule period after World War I. Calamity Jane was a famous American frontier woman photographed in Deadwood, South Dakota, around 1876. Deadwood was a booming gold town, and her rugged clothes helped build the legend that later made her a Wild West performer. In 1912, a huge May Day crowd filled Union Square in New York City, with signs calling for worker education, unity, and shorter hours. May 1st became International Labor Day because workers around the world used that date to demand the 8-hour workday. The Mercury Streamliner was a 1936 New York Central passenger train designed by Henry Dreyfuss to look like a moving Art Deco machine. Its smooth cover hid much of the steam engine shape, making rail travel look futuristic on Chicago streets. In 1915, German soldiers on the Western Front wore early gas masks while sitting inside a trench during the World War I. The masks show how quickly trench warfare forced armies to create new protection for a battlefield soldiers had never faced before. This Fairey Firefly aircraft folded its wings upward so more planes could fit on the deck of HMS Venerable. On aircraft carriers, saving space mattered because every meter of deck could decide how many planes the ship could carry. The Kirov Reservoir Dam in Kyrgyzstan has a giant carved head built into its concrete wall, turning a water project into a Soviet-era monument. The dam stands in the Talas region, where the road crosses directly above the reservoir. In 1951, people at Goose Rock in Maine moved an entire house along the coast by placing it on pontoons and using the tide. The house was floated from one spot to another near Kennebunkport, and still exists today. On May 1, 1976, thousands marched and performed in Moscow's Red Square for the Soviet May Day parade. The giant sign says, "Communism will win," showing how the USSR turned a workers' holiday into a huge public display of state power. Around 1873, Russia built the Novgorod, a strange round ironclad ship that looked more like a floating platform than a normal vessel. Its circular shape was meant to carry heavy naval equipment in shallow coastal waters while keeping the ship compact. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese troops entered the Independence Palace in Saigon after South Vietnam surrendered. The room became a symbol of the end of the Vietnam War and the start of a unified Vietnam under communist rule. In 1935, the AN-T-20 Maxim Gorky flew over Moscow's May Day parade as one of the largest airplanes of its time. Just 17 days later, the giant plane was lost during a flight, making this one of its final public appearances. These soldiers were resting on the road to the Piave Front, one of the key Italian battle lines of World War I. The horse cart and tired men show how armies still moved much of their gear by animal power in 1917 and 1918. The Novgorod was a Russian armored ship from 1873 with an almost round hull designed to carry heavy equipment while staying compact. Its shape made it one of the strangest naval experiments of the 1800s. In the 1970s, a young Soviet woman operated a CK-5 combine during the USSR's huge harvest campaign. The sign above her links the machine to a youth farming team, showing how whole families and students were sent into the fields. In 1940, crowds in Gironde, France, watched 3 Morin-Saulnier MS-315 training planes fly low over an airshow field. These small French aircraft were built for pilot training, so the show was about control, timing, and close formation flying. On May 1, 1968, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser gave a Labor Day speech celebrating workers as a central part of the state. The Arabic signs behind him read, "Work is honor, work is a right, work is duty, and work is life." In April 1917, 2 German soldiers stood in a forward trench post during World War I. One watches over the trench edge while the other holds extra equipment, showing how close and tense frontline duty could be. Austro-Hungarian soldiers hold a covered position on the Eastern Front during World War I. The low roof, thick coats, and packed line show how soldiers spent long hours in cold trenches, far from open battlefield movement. After the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear plant accident in Ukraine, a group of firefighters was treated at a hospital in Kyiv instead of Moscow. Many of the Kyiv patients survived, making this photo a rare view of a lesser-known medical story from Chernobyl. In winter 1914 to 1915, workers and soldiers built a deep World War I trench in Masuria, East Prussia. The huge cut in the ground shows how quickly the war turned into a system of fixed positions, mud, timber, and long waiting. An Austro-Hungarian naval pilot is being helped into flight gear beside a Loner L flying boat during World War I. This aircraft could take off from water, giving the Navy eyes over the sea before radar existed. In March 1943, a woman in Verona, New Jersey, sewed the edge of an American flag at the Annan Flag Company. The company supplied flags during World War II, when even factory sewing became part of the national effort. On April 14, 1916, photographer Ernest Brooks captured a shell burst near British trenches south of Arras in northern France. The dark cloud shows how World War I soldiers could be struck from far away without ever seeing the other side. In 1947, a Japanese woman in Hiroshima was photographed 2 years after the 1945 atomic bombing. Her bandaged hand shows that the effects of that day were still visible long after the city began rebuilding. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.